I'm Barry Silverberg, Director of the Center for Nonprofit Studies at Austin Community College. Welcome to Civil Society, where we explore issues affecting our communal well-being through a nonprofit lens. We are a proud partner of ACCTV. My guest today is Ken Gladish, retired President and CEO and Senior Philanthropic Advisor at the Seton Foundation. Ken spent the vast majority of his life in the world of philanthropy. He served with the Indianapolis Central Indiana Community Foundation, the Indiana Humanities Council, and as President and CEO of the Austin Community Foundation. He also serves as a visiting scholar at Indiana University Center of Philanthropy, and 6.5 years as the President of the YMCA of the USA, during which he traveled the country and world representing the YMCA. And that leaves out many other roles he has played as a professional and volunteer leader. Ken received his bachelor's degree from Hanover College, where he currently serves on its Board of Trustees. His master's and PhD are from the University of Virginia in Government and Foreign Affairs. Ken, I'm thrilled to have you on the show today. It's really good to be with you. So we're entitling today's episode Confessions of a Philanthropoid. So what is a philanthropoid?
Right. Well, it's a somewhat facetious term, which I take undue credit for, although it's been used by a whole bunch of other commentators and writers about the subject of the charitable and philanthropic sector. I say a philanthropoid is a person who gives other person's money away, as compared to a philanthropist who gives her own money away.
Ah, interesting. So what is philanthropy?
That's a pretty broad question,
Well,
Barry.
we only ask the most important questions on this show.
Well, you know, it comes from, the word philanthropy comes from a derivation of the Greek around the love of mankind, the love of humankind. I liked the definition of philanthropy that was crafted by Robert Payton, now deceased, the late director of the IU Center on Philanthropy, former president of the Exxon Education Foundation, where he said, philanthropy is voluntary action for the public good. Voluntary action for the public good, meaning it's more than an exchange relationship of financial resources, but includes volunteerism, activism, advocacy, and engagement in the larger public good activities that any culture or society has.
So it's more than just giving money.
It is. Most people, you know, when you're reading about newspaper stories or you're having a conversation in your community, when they think of philanthropy, they think of the major foundations. In our own community,
Right.
It would be something like the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation or the St. David's Foundation. You had Earl Maxwell as a guest on your show. Or the Austin Community Foundation. But beyond the aggregation of financial resources and the making of grants to support good work, there's a whole range of activities that come under the umbrella of philanthropy in a particular community.
So, as I mentioned in the intro, you've had and I didn't tick off all of your accomplishments and all the service you've provided to our society. What of all of that, your long and distinguished career, what are you proudest of?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. I guess I'm proudest of the partnerships in which I engaged with board members, staff colleagues, and volunteers in the variety of nonprofit organizations that I had the privilege of working with and for. I'm proudest of the fact that I made it through a career with no scandals, because in the current and contemporary life, especially when you're dealing with major national organizations like the YMCA, there are all kinds of issues and challenges that you don't anticipate, that you don't control, that you're not in charge of.
I understand the investigations aren't complete.
That's probably true, Barry, sadly so.
So when you talk about partnership between professionals and volunteers, how would you characterize those partnerships? What is the ideal relationship from the level of activity you've engaged in?
Yeah. The volunteers who serve as board members, as volunteer board members
Yep.
of nonprofit organizations, at their best are attracted by a common devotion to the mission, whatever the mission of that organization is.
Right.
That the most important thing for them ought to be and is that their actions as a board member support the development, the creativity, the impact of the organization, and not that it has a positive impact on their reputation, on their standing, or on their recognition in the community. Now, I would hope that most volunteer board members would get credit in the community for what they've done. But that should not be the motivation. The motivation should be around common devotion to the mission. Leave self at the door and engage together in common effort on behalf of whatever the mission might be. In the case of the YMCA, as an example, the mission in short was we build strong kids, strong families, and strong communities. In the case of the Community Foundation, it was a devotion to the creative development of philanthropy in the community to support the most important needs that were being expressed. And of course, the nonprofit sector includes everything from organizations that focus on basic human needs and poverty to high art and higher education, everything in between. And they are a characteristic mark of the particular culture out of which you and I have grown, the United States of America and its history.
Right. So we started our relationship when I had asked you, and you'd moved to Austin, and as head of the Community Foundation, and asked you to share a piece you wrote about July 4th and liberty and the nonprofit sector. So given the turbulence of our times, what is the contribution that the nonprofit sector makes to American democracy?
You know, I have the privilege of teaching graduate courses at the LBJ School's RGK Center on Philanthropy. And in trying to think of a kind of formative dialogue that one could have with students of the nonprofit sector, I hit upon the idea that perhaps one of the most important and not as widely commented on attributes of the sector in our own society, the Society of the United States of America, was that the nonprofit sector itself was a major contributor to our freedom, to our liberty, and to our form of government. We oftentimes limit that conversation to the formal activities of government, legislative bodies, executive bodies, the electoral process, the legal process. But in actuality, I think, if you go back to the founding of the Republic, you find at the beginning this idea that there ought to be some kind of an independent sector. We actually have 4 sectors in American life, right? We have the business sector, the government sector, the nonprofit or independent sector, and then I would add a 4th, according to kind of Aristotelian thinking, the family sector. A terrific historian of the American South, a woman by the name of Anne Fryer Scott, in a lovely book called Natural Allies about the women's associations of the antebellum South, writes that those associations were like miniature republics in which the women of the South learned the instincts, the disciplines, the ideals, and the habits of citizenship. And I think one could say that in addition to the proximate good that nonprofit organizations accomplish, whether it's in healthcare or education or the arts, there is this overarching contribution they make to our society. Because you think about it, the same skill sets that are necessary to be a good citizen or to serve in government are required of those who lead nonprofits or who serve as nonprofit board members. So the ideal of coming to consensus, participation, voting, the use of formal procedures on decision making, and engagement in understanding the larger culture. So these things all combine to create an environment in which nonprofit organizations, in addition to the proximate good, are making a major contribution to creating citizens for the future of the United States. And this goes all the way down to kind of elementary and junior high and high school in student government organizations and membership associations and the rest. And I think at our peril, we don't pay attention to that piece of the nature of the nonprofit and philanthropic sector in every community in America.
So in what I'm hearing you say is that it's really a great learning environment for the folks who eventually become our politicians and statesmen and government leaders.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, some of the demographic studies that have been accomplished around the coincidence of experiences in the nonprofit sector and larger civic participation suggest, for instance, that persons who attend religious ceremonies of whatever kind, have a religious affiliation of whatever kind, are more likely to vote, as an example. Young people who arise out of civic associations like the Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the Boys and Girls Clubs and the rest are more likely to participate in volunteers in their community. There's all kinds of correlations between the experiences of working as a volunteer or as a board member of the nonprofit sector and being a member of a community as a citizen. And as you suggested, in the troubling and challenging and difficult times in which we live, one of our major challenges is getting enough people to participate. And so there's such an interesting balance of experience and ideals that cross over between the government and political sector and the nonprofit sector as well.
So is that fostering of social responsibility and connection?
Exactly.
So you've been in the nonprofit sector, the philanthropic sector, call it what you will, for a long time. So you've dealt with a lot of the myths people have. What are some of the major myths that you'd like to debunk?
Well, one is that the sector and its organizations are self-fulfilling, that they're always going to be there, that we can rely upon these historic and contemporary institutions to be present in our midst, regardless of the economic or political or other circumstances. Not true. They take the active, total, engaged in participation of a very substantial number of people. Another myth is, I think, that you get in this conversation about, well, how many homeless organizations do you need? Or how many organizations that feed the poor and hungry do you need? Or how many theaters do you need in the nonprofit sector? There's a kind of current conversation around, well, aren't we having too many of these things? And I consider myself to be a kind of radical Tocquevillian. Alexis Tocqueville, the French historian and writer, essayist, who in the early 19th century came to the United States and wrote about us to try to learn what he might as an advisor and participant in the democratic development in France. He suggested that the most distinctive thing about American society was the inclination of Americans to create associations. I somewhat facetiously, paraphrasing the New Testament, say in the New Testament it was said that this teacher prophet Jesus said, wherever two or three are gathered in his name, there should he be. I think in the United States, in fact, right now and for a long time, wherever two or three are gathered, there shall be a nonprofit organization. I happen to think that's a very healthy thing, not an unhealthy thing. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. And in fact, there is another myth.
Is that in the New Testament?
No. There is, in fact, a circumstance in which people believe that if they can concentrate all their efforts together in one organization, that somehow they'll be more efficient and effective. I don't believe that that's true. It's a debatable and arguable position, and there's lots of robust conversation and debate about it in the scholars and students and analysts of the nonprofit sector. So those are a couple of the myths, I think, that
I would totally agree with you. The more the better, and let the market forces prevail.
Oh, that's exactly. The idea is, there's no market in the nonprofit world. Well, there is, because nonprofit organizations are founded, thrive, and survive or not, depending on the effectiveness that they have in the communities they serve.
So why'd you get involved in all this?
Well, when I was a couple times being hired for nonprofit organizations, same question was asked. Why? I said that I consider myself to be the beneficiary of unbelievable generosity from the beginning of my life to my current circumstances. I started life in an orphanage in Illinois, in Peoria, Illinois. I was adopted, which was a nonprofit organization. I was adopted by two parents who wanted nothing more than to have a family, to love that family, and to live with them in a good community. Two parents who volunteered actively in the YMCA in my community, not surprisingly, in our Presbyterian church, in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. And my mom and dad were two persons who had a high school education, who did everything they could possibly do to have a good life together as husband and wife and as parents. And their modeling, in part, gave me the idea that this was a good thing to do. So from the time I was in elementary school selling Duran Thin Mints,
Duran
Thin Mints, D-U-R-A-N, Thin Mints, which were sold by young boys and girls who participated in the YMCA to support world service work by the YMCA and the rest of the world. Through high school, the American Field Service, the International Exchange Program, where we also sold chocolate-covered almonds. Candy somehow is involved in all this. And all of my work from the time I was a junior high student through college was at the YMCA that I grew up in. So it kind of was destined to be that I would be interested in and participate in the nonprofit sector. And I was active in student government in high school and college, and in fundraising activities of all kinds. And I found it to be emotionally satisfying. I found it to be morally rewarding. I found the people that were involved, both as volunteers, as leaders, and as participants, to be really great, fun to be with, and exciting and interesting to engage with. And like one thing led to another. I don't think there's ever a particular moment where I said I'm going to spend my career in the nonprofit sector, but on balance, I'm glad I did.
That's great, and I think society is better because of it.
Well,
Seriously.
maybe little pieces of society.
Well, I think large chunks. Right. So as you were going through your career, you learned a lot, obviously. You absorbed a lot of information. What do you wish you would have known when you started your career?
Yeah. 2 or 3 things. One is, and I think this is a problem for leaders in the sector at large, I was far less well educated and far less exposed to finance as a tool, understanding the money angle of an organization and how it ran and developed. I think in the sector, Barry, sometimes this is true, for the most part it's true, that people are advanced in their careers as a consequence of their virtuosity as a program person, right? So if you're in a community recreation program, right, or if you're even on a faculty, you're really good at that one thing that you're doing, and people recognize that, and you're asked to take on the next role, the next role, the next role. As you rise up in the organization, more and more finance becomes an important part of management, understanding, administration, and goal setting. What is it? It said where you spend your money, that's where your heart is. And so I wish I'd had better training, better background, and better exposure. As it was, you had to do it kind of by the seat of your pants. Yep. As you had an opportunity to take on more and more responsibility. So that's one thing. 2, I wish I had had better training and or mentoring in the management of groups, of group work. So I was not an undergraduate in social work or in psychology where I might have picked up those things. I was in political science and in philosophy. But I think if I'd had a more discrete and focused training on group work, that I could have been a better leader. And in fact, as a young YMCA employee in the professional education programs of the Y, a lot of effort and energy was spent on that question. So I had a chance to pick some of it up. A third would be, I wish I had understood how better to supervise young people. And I learned that along the way, but that was an important part, to recruit, to identify, engage, and then train and lift up young people with whatever skill sets were necessary in the particular organization that I had the privilege of serving. So those are a few things I think would have been
very
helpful.
Insightful. So what would you tell somebody going into the arena? And I consider the nonprofit sort of the arena.
Yeah.
Okay. What would you tell somebody entering into the arena or thinking about entering the arena, based upon your sagacity?
Right, there you go. Yes, I have a little sagacity. I think 2 or 3 things. One, that you can have a rewarding and productive career vocation for your whole life in the sector. That the diversity of opportunities for professional service and leadership are so vast that you should begin with the idea of a career and a mission. Mm-hmm. Second, I would say go to work, if you're going to work in the nonprofit sector, for an organization in whose mission you believe that you can invest in. So it's not just the job or the paycheck, but it's what is accomplished by the organization that provides that job and that right. paycheck, and the way in which you might be able to make a significant and substantial contribution as an employee. I would say third, make an effort also, however, if you're in the sector, to carve out some time and space for your own health, emotional well-being, and break. Because when you're inside of nonprofit organizations, which for the most part don't have a large number of extra staff, you're going to be working 24/7 and available all the time around the mission of the organization. Be conscientious, conscious, and deliberate about taking time for yourself, for personal growth and development, for relaxation,
yep.
and for engagement. And especially if you made the choice and have the privilege of having a family, take the time to attend to your family. Because I would say a couple times in my own career, I probably didn't spend the kind of time that would have been warranted for my family, for my wife and our two children. And if I look back, I think, well, you know, those few hours I could have devoted more time to the family. So those are a few things I'd say to a young person.
Yeah, we tend to be rather self-abusive in the nonprofit sector. We're so caught up in our mission that sometimes we forget about ourselves in the process. And I think your words certainly remind us of the importance of that.
I guess that one other thing I would say, which is kind of I guess it might be a disappointment about working in the sector, that is to say, it is not true that working in the sector means you will avoid all the common problems and issues of working in government or the for-profit sector. I mean, there are people in the nonprofit sector, just as there are on these others, and they have their peccadillos, they have their strengths and their weaknesses. They can be mean, just like other people can.
Really?
And so I think it's important to recognize that even though you're in this sector, which claims for itself a higher moral ground and has a missional focus that is rooted in some moral conviction, you're still going to experience all of the difficulties and challenges and stresses and strains of working in a human institution and organization. And don't be disappointed by that, but you know, kind of redouble your efforts and understand that that's just a part of working in the sector.
So, very quickly, because we're running out of time, what do you see as the future of the philanthropic sector, the nonprofit sector, although they are somewhat different, in our city of Austin in the next 10 years?
Yeah. You know, when you get a bunch of nonprofit executive and activists in Austin together, there are 2 or 3 themes which always rise to the surface, right? One is, well, Austin is a place in which there's an untold amount of competition for financial resources and volunteers. We have one of the largest number of nonprofits, and wouldn't it be better if we had less? Well, I will predict we're not going to have less, because the inventiveness of people around a variety of missions, again, from basic human needs to higher education, are incredibly creative. And so we're not going to have fewer nonprofit organizations. I don't care how many scholars tell us that we should have fewer, how many analysts or philanthropists or foundation executives, we are not going to have fewer organizations. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think that's a good thing.
I totally agree.
Yeah. Secondly, a major theme has got to be the identification, engagement, and uplift of a rising generation of nonprofit leaders, both volunteers and professionals. And that's going to be a big challenge. Always has been. It's not going to change. And it'll be interesting to see what the baby boom generation, our generation, has bequeathed to the next in terms of that role.
I'm a Gen Xer.
There you go. Yeah, sure. We have a lot of young people who would just as soon have the baby boom generation get out of the way because they're prepared to take on the reins of leadership. And I think Austin has an incredible resource of young people, and the city benefits from the fact that we're a magnet for all kinds of other activities and organizations. Third, I would say that we're going to see an increasing share of the wealth of rising generations devoted to unique forms of philanthropic engagement. The continued acceleration of the donor-advised fund, the development of nonprofit LLCs, of low-profit organizations. We're in a moment of extraordinary creativity, and I'm hopeful that that creativity will lead to the creation of a whole range of approaches that will make a major contribution to both solving problems and uplifting the community.
My very last question, because we're almost out of time,
Right.
is I'm honored to be a guest at your UT class once a year, and I'm glad you invite me, and it's a great opportunity. And you interview me as part of that process. How does it feel to being on the other end?
Well, unaccustomed as I am to speaking
Yes.
or sharing my opinion,
That's right.
I enjoy it. And I think the fact that you're using the show to feature nonprofit leaders is significant. We need more of that exposure in conversation.
Well, Ken, it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Barry.
Thank you very much.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching Civil Society, and thank you to ACCTV for producing this show. You can read more about Ken Gladish, find links to the subjects we discussed today, and view previous episodes at nonprofitaustin.org/civil society. Thank you very much.